When was the last time that you were really, really scared? Who did you turn to in your time of need? I'm lucky. I have always found safety and comfort in my home with my family. But the same is not true for everyone. I can't forget this one harrowing phone call that I received in the early days of the pandemic. "Help me, please." This young 15-year-old girl was pleading with me over the phone. It was January 2020, and schools had shut down indefinitely in Hong Kong. She shared that her parents had told her that they would have to take her back home because they couldn't afford to live in the city without work. She was afraid that her family was going to force her to get married, especially since there was no certainty on when she would return to school again. "I can't speak to my teachers or school social workers," she said. "I can't even talk to my friends. If they tell their parents, our community is so small, I'm afraid that it'll all happen even faster," she said. "You've got to help me, please." This conversation is etched in my mind. I think about this girl every day. The last I heard from her, she was on her way to the airport. But without laws against forced marriage in place in Hong Kong and little evidence that this would be her fate, I never heard from her again. I am a law professor, and my work focuses on human rights issues, especially those affecting the most marginalized communities in Hong Kong. In my research and in my community outreach work, I come across many such young girls from Hong Kong's ethnic minority communities who are at risk of forced marriage. Sometimes we're able to help them, but sometimes they disappear. Their parents take away their phones and laptops or whisk them out of Hong Kong, far beyond the reach of the city's jurisdiction. These are Hong Kong girls. They become invisible, silenced. I understand what's at stake here. I know well these familiar pressures of patriarchy. What can we do? COVID has shown us the importance of community. I have found COVID really challenging and isolating. And for many women and children, just having someone to turn to could mean the difference between leading a life of equal dignity or falling into complete oblivion. Yet COVID has been heralded as this great equalizer, as though we've all experienced it in exactly the same way. But my work in Hong Kong reveals a different truth, that COVID is the great amplifier. It has made things far worse for Hong Kong's most vulnerable groups, especially women and children, and even more so those among ethnic minorities. COVID is beckoning us to build community before the next crisis strikes. Did you know that during the early days of the pandemic, the number of cases of domestic violence doubled compared to the same period in 2019? Let's consider the impact of COVID on children. In the first 9 months of 2021, child abuse cases spiked sharply by 66%. The majority of these cases were physical abuse cases, which had increased by 70%. while sexual abuse cases against children shot up by 62%. But COVID has driven even further underground child abuse cases, because children could not seek out their teachers or school social workers for help when schools were shut. And this became very clear to me in May 2021 when I was called in to help with the case of a 4-year-old girl who was found to be severely malnourished. The case only came to light because schools had resumed and her teachers noticed that she was always hungry, lethargic, and pale. Her parents had routinely withheld food and drink from her as a way of punishing her. Worse, this little girl is in a children's ward at a public hospital because there is no place for her in foster care or residential care homes because there is a critical shortage of places in Hong Kong. This data highlights only the plight of the general population. But COVID has had a far more significant impact on ethnic minority communities due to poverty, unemployment, language barriers, racism, and visa precarities. The intersections of these experiences and disadvantages has meant that they are far more vulnerable to falling through the gaps. They become invisible and silenced. What can we do? Since COVID restrictions have been implemented, cramped living conditions, work from home, and online learning have turned households with abusers into pressure cooker situations in which victims have found themselves completely trapped. Resources were already scarce since before the pandemic. And during the pandemic, 5,500 cases of domestic violence were reported to the Social Welfare Department. Less than 5% of these reported cases could be housed at shelters across Hong Kong because we only have 268 beds across 5 refuges. Even then, the shelters can only house these women for a couple of weeks at a time. In early 2020, 75% of domestic abuse victims were afraid to even go to shelters because they were afraid of catching COVID. Can you imagine back then having to choose between protecting yourself against violence or risking COVID? In the numerous calls that I've received and in my research, it has become clear that these systemic problems make women, especially ethnic minority women, uniquely vulnerable to abuse. In a heartbreaking example of this, in March 2020, I was called in to help a 19-year-old Punjabi woman who had sought assistance from an NGO. She shared that her husband had tried to strangle her one night after a severe escalation in verbal and physical abuse. She rang the police. When they arrived, they spoke only to her father-in-law, who had answered the door and spoke fluent Cantonese. At no point was any attempt made to verify the circumstances with her, the person who made the call in the first place. She was told to pack a few belongings to take with her to a shelter for things to cool down for a couple of days. She gathered her things and picked up her 8-month-old daughter, only to be told to set her daughter back down. She was going to return home in a couple of days anyway, and besides, There was no room for her daughter at the shelter, she was told. Trusting this advice, this young mother left for the shelter for temporary respite against the violence. But she was so desperate to see her daughter that she ended up leaving the shelter early, and she went home. But when she got there, her family refused to open the door to her. It has been 21 months, and this young mother has not seen her daughter, hasn't been able to hold her or hug her. As a mother, just the thought of not being able to see my son is unbearable. But this young woman's tragedy is invisible, silenced. What can we do? COVID isn't the root cause of domestic violence, and these stories aren't new. But COVID is quicksand for victims of abuse, pulling them deeper into their hole of suffering. These stories really stick with me. They haunt my conscience. These systemic problems have been staring us in the face since before COVID. And I ask myself, why aren't we more outraged? And what can we do to prevent the next tragedy? Systemic failures do need to be addressed, but that doesn't mean that we need to sit back and wait for that to happen. Ask yourselves, in these past 2 years when you have needed support with a COVID-related problem, who have you turned to? Government resources or websites? Or your virtual communities on Facebook and WhatsApp? One of the most powerful things that COVID has shown us is just how much of a difference each of us, ordinary people, can make in each other's lives. From organizing halal food for those who are in quarantine, to distributing masks and sanitizers and even laptops to those in need. We have the power to do something here. It is possible. In September 2020, a young 21-year-old woman WhatsApped me asking me for help. Her parents had forbidden her from going to community college anymore because they had plans to marry her off. She decided to run away. I tapped into our community, and I was able to arrange a shelter space, counseling, social worker support, fees for her education, legal representation, and somebody to accompany her. Within 1 month, with the help of trusted friends and professionals, we were able to reunite this family. They sat down and worked out a plan to enable her to complete her education and agreed to postpone the question of marriage till later. We can be the solution to this broken system. Let's act before the next crisis strikes. So how do we do this? Let's recreate the village. We can do this on any scale that we choose. You could take a small, micro action to disrupt abuse. The next time you hear what sounds like an abusive situation next door, ring the doorbell. Ask for a cup of sugar. In India, this campaign successfully disrupted many situations of domestic violence. Or you could offer more, your time, kindness, and compassion. Show up by holding a victim's hand, being there for her as her confidant or her mentor. For many victims of abuse, just having someone by their side as they navigate through the community system of support can make all the difference in the world. Or thinking bigger, imagine if we all came together to snowball change. What if we addressed the shelters and the lack of beds to help victims of abuse or fostered a neglected child? How many of you out here own properties or can source vacant hotel rooms for those who need to escape violence? In this room alone, we have amongst us doctors, lawyers, teachers, counselors, realtors, people with networks, resources, and expertise. Harness your power, your professionalism, and passion. Let's turn COVID into an amplifier for action instead of inequality. Because that is what matters most now. And it is on us. Thank you.